Well, thank you very much, Gary, for inviting me here today, and it's great to see such a big turnout, partly for obvious reasons, because so much is happening, but the original programme we had I thought was very exciting. It was a programme that became more exciting with the Clara element as well. My topic today was continuous cover forestry, but I think in the last few weeks the word resilience has become yet more important, and so I've tried to adapt my thinking a little bit to emphasize the importance of continuous cover forestry, not for some of the wide range of reasons that people have discussed in the context of CCF before, but actually coming down to a very fundamental idea that we, as John Weir and other speakers have been saying today, the key issue we now face is woodland resilience, and that's for climate, pest diseases, a whole range of reasons. So I've subtitled the talk Silviculture for Woodland Resilience in Britain. I think one thing when it comes to silviculture we always have to remember is that change is something that we live with constantly. It's all about change. So all our resources and decisions are made in a mood or frame of mind which is certain to change. And I think that's something that guides a lot of my thinking and is maybe useful as a start to this talk. I've got a number of ideas I want to introduce and cover. First of all, I'm going to give a context from my perspective, and it maybe touches on some of the things we've touched on already this morning. So a context for continuous cover forestry in Britain. A little bit on the evolution of silvicultural thinking, because silviculture is a science, it's a discipline, it's a very applied science, but it has its own genesis and its own traditions, and I think there's an evolutionary pattern there that's important just to remind ourselves of. And then what is CCF, for those who maybe are not so familiar with it. A quick touch on the silvicultural systems which underpin the application of CCF, and then some approaches, examples, and a conclusion. And I'm going to try and do all that in a short time. Okay. Well, the first point I want to make is something's already been said today. We can classify our forest estate into maybe 4 broad woodland types, but the most important point here is that majority of it, the vast majority of our woodland is 65% or more is of plantation origin. That implies it's even aged and single species. Another important point I want to get out at the beginning is that within this plantation resource, if we just look at the conifer component, I think this is a John Weir statistic, we've got 88% of that resource is just 4 or 5 species: Scots pine, Corsica pine, Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, and larches. So we have very much simplified systems in our forests, and that's our tradition, really. We've spent most of the last 100 years mastering the art of simplification and commodification, applying sort of agricultural principles. As a result, and this is statistics from a paper by Bill Mason, we can demonstrate, yes, that our forest is increasing in area through time, so 1947, 65, 82, and up to 2000. But one of the things that's very clear on this graphic is that the vast majority of the woodland exists within a fairly narrow age range, 15 to 50 years, and it's dominated by these conifers I was talking about. If we apply a little bit of ecological thinking on top of that, Oliver and Larson talk about 4 stages in forest succession. Stand initiation, stem exclusion, which is where the trees grow up and close canopy, and so there's insufficient shade for understory regeneration. And then a later stage where you start to get canopy breaking up a little and you get understory initiation, So that's understory regeneration. And then you move on to an old growth stage. You can see that our woodlands, from an ecological point of view, are very much in this stem exclusion phase. We haven't got a balance across the ecological stages of development that you might find in a large natural forest type. With all the climate change research, there's been some in-depth look at these dynamics, the species, the structure, etc. And Mark Broadmeadow's alarming results here from applying some of the climate change scenarios to the forest types and the silvicultural systems suggests that over the next 70 or 80 years, a very high proportion, between 60 and 70% of our woodland is going to become marginal or unsuitable for, based on the current practices we're applying. So there's a clear driver for us to think again about silviculture and how we're going to diversify our approach so that we have these woodlands that are resilient in the face of climate change. Of course, it's not just climate change, it's the very recent developments on the biosecurity front. This graphic here, taken from the independent panel report, shows us time frame from the 1960s up to the present day. But the most striking thing is this year-on-year increase in the number of pests and diseases that are coming in. And one of our major species after another seems to be being affected. That's a pattern that's not likely to change. So there are climate change and there are biosecurity drivers, and the policy documents have been coming forward from the Forestry Commission. It's already out there, and the key points are that we need to adapt in an anticipatory way. We need to think about actually accepting that there are risks, but not risk averse. So in other words, we need to take some risks, I think, and in this process of going forward. And underlying all of that is this need to diversify. So for strategies for diversification, John was talking just before lunch on mainly this one, the need to diversify species in new woodlands, which is achieved by native species provenance selection or by introducing new non-native species. What I'm really interested in is diversification of the silvicultural systems in existing woodlands. So that means moving to a wider range of stand types, so greater complexity in the structure and the species composition, as well as mixing the species up more. And there's a lot of science underlying this in terms of continuous cover. The Reid report came out very strongly in favour of the need to have more structurally complex forest stands. 4 reasons were given: more wind firm, more even carbon storage, lower soil carbon losses during harvesting, and they maintain higher humidity levels, which is important for a wide range of things, regeneration, biodiversity, etc. So there's strong drivers for diversification of silvicultural systems. And there's an overarching context, I think, as well, which is worth pointing out, which has been ongoing maybe for a period of decades now in the way that we view forestry and we move forward. This graphic here just simplifies the evolution of silviculture into 5 areas. The primary focus being the unit of production. And in terms of an evolutionary trend, we've gone from thinking in terms of the tree as the unit of production to the ecosystem. In terms of ecological factors, we've gone from this simplification and regular stand structure to starting to think more about mixed, irregular situations. In terms of the dynamics, we've gone from an attempt to simplify forest dynamics to actually embrace the concept of complexity. And in terms of management factors, we've gone from the idea of single and discrete objectives for management to, again, embracing multiple and integrated decision objectives. And in terms of decision making, of course, one of the things that's been most difficult for the forestry profession has been this transition from, and this is true for all professions, whether it's medicine, accountancy, engineering, or anything, any of the professions have had to deal with this transition from being in charge, knowing what's best, applying their knowledge, without any real regulation or oversight, to this culture where we're now and where the informed public has a much greater say, and we're much more responsible for communicating what we're doing to that public. So where does CCF fit within all of this? A basic definition for continuous cover forestry is the use of silvicultural systems whereby the forest canopy is maintained at one or more levels without clear felling. So the absence of clear felling is a key part of it. The UK Forestry Standard got onto this very early in the 90s, and I think that's the first one that came out in the late 90s. And they called for the identification of areas which are or will be managed under a continuous cover forestry system and to have them built into forest designs. Their definitions, again, focusing on clear felling. Clear felling was defined as anything over 0.25 hectares. And the distinctive element of continuous cover forestry is therefore the avoidance of clear felling of areas much more than 2 tree heights wide without the retention of some mature trees. Okay. I'll go back, I'll get this, yeah. Now, another point I want to make in this talk is that it's not actually new. A lot of the ideas about diversification of silvicultural stand structures have been around for a long time. And of course, different authors and different traditions have developed. And as a result, we have this complexity of different terminology. So I just want to make the point that there's lots of different language out there that people use. But what I'm sort of saying in terms of continuous cover forestry is just we want to get more diverse structures with a wider range of species involved. So, you can go back to, probably the origins of the science are in the German literature, where they called Dauerwald, which actually is almost literally translates to continuous cover forest, permanent forest. Okay, key components of CCF. First of all, managing the forest ecosystem. That shouldn't be radical. That's the essence. As I said, in this tradition, it's not about the tree, it's about the ecosystem. Using natural processes, working within site limitations, and diversifying stand structure. All of these elements which make up continuous cover forestry are coming on strongly now in these policy things I talked about at the beginning. So it's an approach to sustainable forestry and not just one silvicultural system. It's embedded within the ideas and the science that are now driving forestry forward. And there are several organisations. ProSilva is the European one, and the Continuous Cover Forestry Group. 2 key organisations that actually for over 20 years now have been driving forward the subject through both science and practice, developing demonstration forests, workshops, developing some of the techniques and the protocols for taking CCF forward. However, as I said a few minutes ago, there's nothing really very new in forestry. A lot of things are now being rediscovered that were around a long, long time ago. And there's one person in my education, I'm not quite, in fact, I was born 2 years after this gentleman passed away, but there's one person in my forestry education who I have come to admire greatly. I think he's one of the great thinkers. He was way, way, way ahead of his time. Of course, that's Mark Loudon Anderson, who was Professor of Forestry at Edinburgh University from 1951 to 1961. He is well known for a number of things in forestry. He was one of the instigators of the Institute of Chartered Foresters, for example. But his great contributions, I think, can be summed up in these papers, all from the early 1950s through to 1960. This one here is probably his most famous publication, The Selection of Tree Species on an Ecological Basis. Here we are 60, 70 years on, having this exact same discussion about matching species to site. He really was developing these ideas way ahead of where we currently are. We're rediscovering some of the ideas that he's put forward. And similarly, when it came to diversification of stand structures and the need for greater complexity, he had all these ideas in the 50s as well. He was taking the idea of understanding natural forest dynamics and working to match species and ecosystems at the site level. So he wasn't necessarily requiring us to have native ecosystems, but understanding the principles of how forest ecosystems work from regeneration through to old growth. So it's worth looking at that old literature because there's a lot of ideas there. And how am I doing for time? Okay, so yes, so Mark Anderson, one of the great thinkers, and he was thinking in terms not just of planted forests with rotations. He was looking at the whole forest as an ecosystem through from its initial stage of establishment through to these old growth phases. And he thought that in Britain we needed to embrace all of this, either by working with our existing woodlands and understanding the dynamic of those, or in the newer planted forests that came on at the early part of the 20th century, allowing these to go on beyond just the stage where they would be felled in a clear-cutting system, but on through to these late retentions, as he thought that they would sort themselves out through time and express the optimum species would be expressed on the site. So he set up the trial at Glentress. Sorry, I'm going ahead of myself. He set up the first trial at Glentress. It's very well known. It's 120 hectares or so, established in 1952. And he applied some of the thinking from the Swiss, French, and German foresters who'd been working on this in the 19th century. And he set about trying to develop a complex structure that actually worked according to a set of rules that could be prescribed. And so he set out the forest in a series of blocks. And he had this idea that 1/6 of the forest would be worked in any 1 year. And by harvesting in small groups over 60 years, he would create an irregular structure forest, and it would be producing a constancy of different forest products from pulp and pole stage material through to high quality saw logs. And he saw the high quality saw logs as the driver for the system, making it all possible. And as byproducts, we would have all of these ecological benefits that people ascribe to continuous cover forests. So he made these small groups, and they've been continued on through time in a haphazard manner. And of course, we learned very early on that in British forests we have to handle a lot of problems along the way. In this case, browsing from deer. You can't achieve a lot without controlling deer when it comes to these natural systems. And however, it is possible to develop these irregular structure stands. This is a maturing group selection at Glentress. This is John Blythe, who inherited the management of the forest in the 90s. And we see that over time, indeed, this forest has taken on an irregular structure. The blue curve here, this is just based on one of the blocks. The blue curve is the situation in 1952 at the start of the trial. You see the number of stems per hectare versus diameters. You see it's an even-aged planted forest to start with. When the 1980 inventory was done, you can see that it's starting to broaden out. And in 1991 with the green, you can see that you're starting to get this classic J curve that's associated with irregular structure forest. So you've got a large number of trees regenerating and coming through with a small number of mature trees which are going to be harvested, creating space for these trees to then fill in the gaps. So it's a functioning, working system and working towards a balanced, irregular structure over 60 years. This is a situation at Glentress just a few weeks ago when I was there. It's hard to tell that this is a planted forest. It's multi-species, it's diverse. This highlights some of the wonders of CCF and why some people are great advocates and proponents of it. It's a very beautiful forest, but I'm sure there are many in the room here sort of wondering, how do we... There's also a lot of problems associated with this, the challenges in terms of keeping the system going and achieving that irregular structure that Anderson was trying to get. Too many big trees cast a lot of shade, that limits regeneration, so you've got to constantly be keeping on top of the system. We're required to have intimate knowledge of the site and a great deal of ecological knowledge, and that's the challenge. But I think that's the challenge that forestry in Britain faces now. We can't have one size fits all. We've got to work very much more at the site level and thinking in terms of the soils, the species, all of the interactions, and putting the package together on a site-by-site basis. I think that's the only way we're going to be able to really move forward. And I think that's why CCF is increasingly important. So, quick comparison. What are the differences? Well, basically, in my view, you can summarize this down to in a clear felling system, you start with a planted situation, forest grows through time, you clear fell, and you then have to kick-start back to the beginning. You reset the clock, in a way. Okay, so you go through the stages of development, and then you restock by one means or another. And you achieve your results through respacing, thinning, and then achieve a final harvest. Well, in continuous cover systems in Britain, it's not actually so different. We're generally starting out with a planted situation and the forest developing, but when we get to that final stage, we're actually wanting to keep something going beyond. We don't reset the clock. We can maintain some cover over the forest site. To be able to do that, though, okay, so instead of clear felling, we retain some trees, but to be able to do that, no, I think I've gone way. I'm not very good on this button, hang on. We need to prepare the forest. That's the key thing about CCF. We need to prepare the forest. You can't just decide at the mature stage of a planted forest that, oh, we want to suddenly have a continuous cover condition. You've got to be thinking ahead. If these trees here are not stable, if they've not been well thinned, then your options close down very dramatically. So the distinction between a clear felling system and a CCF, the transformation to a CCF, is really all about forethought and when and how you do your thinning regimes. That's the key to it. And then you start to have options as the stand opens up and you see regeneration coming in. Okay, I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to skip over these technical details, but the late transformation scenario is really all about how you've prepared the stand to make that step beyond. Rather than resetting the clock, it's about how you take advantage of the forest cover. You've got to take the next the stand forward into this more complex phase. So here's an example from Darnaway Estate, again just taken very recently. This is a well-thinned Western red cedar stand, and you can see it's starting to get this natural regeneration coming in. The trees, the stand is stable, and so the silviculturists here have options as to what they can take forward and how they're going to then treat this site. One of the challenges with CCF is this, as I said a minute or two ago, is this need for information, ecological knowledge, the challenge of working at the site level and applying this broad range of tools and skills that a forester is now required to have. And the text here is going to be too small to see, but it's just to illustrate the point. Okay, so we start with the management pro forma. We're thinking about CCF. So the first thing we need to think about is what have we got? Okay. So we've got some basic details about our forest, but critically we need to know about the soils, nutrient regime, moisture regime, rooting depth, critical things. We need to go out to the forest, assess these parameters and describe in appropriate terms. We need to know about the ground conditions, stand structure, and the species. Okay, so we need to gather a lot of information on a very site-specific basis. Then we have to think about what we want for the forest. So, what are the management objectives? Long-term vision, stand structure, the species, the proportions, and the regeneration method. We have to match what we've got with what we might want and see then what's actually possible. And we can fill this in looking at production targets, conservation targets, and social functions. Okay. All of the things that make CCF a desirable way to go. And then thinking about what are the chances of achieving a transformation to a continuous cover. Here you've got to take into account all these site parameters. So compatibility of management targets, the suitable occurrence stand in terms of species and quality, critical things, the stability, is it producing seed? What are the seedbed conditions, etc., etc. And there are all of these tools now in place or coming forward. So here's Forest Research's scoring system for soil exposure and thinning status. I don't have time to go through it. It's just to point out that we actually have these tools coming on board that can help us make these decisions at these, with these stands. We need to know about exposure, so we can use the dam scoring system. And we need to think about the thinning status, as I've already said. And from that, we can come up with a very simple scoring score, adding up the numbers that we get when we assess the stand, so we can get some indication about the stand's stability. Another simple thing we can do is with the densiometer, we can go in and assess the light levels, and we can relate the light level, the gaps of the gappiness in the crown to the regeneration we've got. This is by simply counting up the dots and crosshairs on this little tool. And you can see that in this case there's 16 out of 100 dots are, is that right, are open to the sky. So 83% canopy crown. So that's a useful little thing we can take into account. And then that links on to look at, again, another tool that's been created within forest research, the likelihood of natural regeneration. So we can assess, make assessments and predictions based on these simple things that we're picking up from the forest. And I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but it takes into account things like the density of seedlings, the density of saplings, the percent of ground that is bare or covered in mosses, the amount of coning we find, and the thinning history. And again, you can come up with a scoring system which helps guide your decisions. Similarly, just skipping on, we can look at how much light is needed for the species that we've got, and we're working with. John Weir talked earlier about how we were working with a much wider range of species in the 50s, and now, of course, we've got used to using a smaller number of species. Here we can, but there's good data available on the requirements of each of the species, their shade tolerances, etc., and that can be linked to the canopy conditions. So the point I'm making is that we actually have a lot of the tools in place to go forward. In your handy little thing here to assess, is a stand, is the regeneration coming through, or is it struggling? Just by taking a sample of the seedlings and saplings, you can look at the leader to lateral length. So long as the leader is maintaining its dominance, there's a good chance that there are adequate light levels in the understory to keep that regeneration going forward. Okay. So what we're talking about in continuous cover forestry is not one silvicultural system. It's applying the full range. Instead of relying, as we have done in the past, on mainly clear felling and the certainties that brings, what we're really looking at is the whole range, the whole suite of silvicultural systems. And that's going to help us achieve a much more diverse forest resource. Okay. So the range of systems. You want me to finish in 2 minutes? Good. Okay, so regeneration takes place. In terms of the basic methods, which are of course well known, the shelterwood systems and selection systems, we're sort of thinking in terms of what are we wanting to achieve? An even under canopy, regeneration in strips, scattered groups, or something that's continuous. And that decision has to be made by matching all of these values that you generate from your assessment of the forest condition. So this is your shelter wood, achieves a sort of regular regeneration, and that brings with it its own operational challenges, which I won't go into, but these are the things we're working on at the moment, and CCF is trying to sort of organize the operations so that they don't damage the regeneration. The groups system, it really is based on the idea of going with what we see regenerating in the understory. So if you find a cone of regeneration, you work with it and you open up your gaps to go with the regenerating group. And there'll be forests where that is the most applicable way forward. Here's a good example of that actually in a pine wood, showing that even in shade intolerant species, this is a possible option. And the classic silvicultural system is the selection one, which most people consider to be a pure system and the one that's most often associated with CCF. But as I'm trying to say, this is just one of the suite that we would consider, depending on the types of species we have, their shade tolerance, and how the forest is actually, what the forest is telling us about what works best for it. Okay. Right. I'm going to go just a couple more minutes. Is that okay? I'll go as fast as I can. The key point I want to make is that we're not to get hung up on silvicultural systems. You can mix and match. It's about what the overall forest is. It's about achieving the complex structure. It's not about just applying one silvicultural system. So this graphic, this cartoon illustrates that point, that you can apply group selection with a strip system to achieve your management objectives. You can mix and match. Okay. Sorry, I'm struggling with this thing. There are a lot of woodlands in Britain now under CCF management, and there are lots of good examples you can look at, and I'm just going to run through two very, very quickly. This is Without Wood. It's a Forestry Commission woodland in the Lake District. And for a number of years now, they've been doing monitoring systems, which are helping guiding, giving them the information they need to make the decisions to apply CCF. So this is looking at the species distribution, looking at sapling development, I think. All this data coming forward from monitoring the forest, helping to guide that thinning regime that's, I said, is very critical, and leading on to then identifying your frame trees, which are going to be your mature crop trees, and working your thinning around that at the same time as encouraging regeneration. And this is the sort of forest that's actually developing at that location. Okay. Complex and diverse, but also producing very high value and large dimension timber. Second forest I want to just whiz through that's working under a different set of principles is also in the Lake District. This is Thirlmere, which is a reservoir supplying water for Greater Manchester. There's an 800-hectare woodland around that, and currently about half of the woodland has been designated for CCF. So it's not just one system at work here. They've applied CCF over about 50%. And the whole idea here is to minimize clear felling, which has got a potentially adverse effect on water quality. So the driver here is an environmental one. And again, working with the system and applying all these tools to yield timber, but also develop an interesting complex structure that's important for the environment. So I'm just going to skip to my conclusions. The point I want to make is there's a lot of information available. We've got the tools in place. And I think now is the time where I think continuous cover forestry, along with these other techniques for diversifying and making our woodlands more resilient, this is the time where we need to go forward with all of this. So I would recommend the Forestry Commission's suite of information and tools, and also this opportunity to visit the sites that are already practicing CCF. My concluding points are that by adapting forests for increased adapting forests for increased resilience is essential in response to climate change and the biosecurity issues. CCF is not new, but is based on the application of ecological knowledge and understanding forest stand dynamics. So there's a challenge there. We need to be much more site-specific. It's an approach to forest management. It's not an exact match for any specific silvicultural system. In order to effect a transformation, we need to be thinking about a program of woodland improvement and thinning from an early stage. There's a growing evidence base for CCF in Britain. Things I haven't really touched on, which I think are key actually to going forward, are we need to revisit the regulatory and grant framework in order to support the wider application of CCF. And our last point is that probably the biggest barrier to us going forward is a need to strengthen our suite of skills, our knowledge, and our education around this topic. Thank you very much, and apologies for my long talk.